I knew my time was up the very second Preston Harrington refused to look up from his screen. He sat there, a 31-year-old kid with a Stanford education, looking at me like I was a piece of junk code that needed to be purged from the server. The room smelled of expensive cologne, fresh espresso, and pure corporate arrogance. I am Keith Vance, 52 years old, and for the last 22 years, I have been the guy who built the cybersecurity core for Sentinel Shield systems. The contracts we secured with the government were worth $850 million, and every single one of them relied on the encryption framework I designed. Yet to this kid, I was just a line item on a spreadsheet, an old relic of the past that was costing the company too much money. He did not ask how I was, nor did he thank me for my more than 2 decades of service. Instead, he started speaking in that polished, empty corporate dialect about organizational efficiency and structural realignment. It was funny hearing him talk about efficiency. I had spent 22 years of my life working late nights, missing family dinners, and staying up until dawn to make sure our systems were secure from foreign hackers. I built the walls that protected military communications, and now he was optimizing me out of my own office. Preston flipped open a file containing my career history as if he were scanning a menu at a fancy restaurant. He told me that I had done decent work over the years, but the company was moving in a new, agile direction. He said they needed younger talent who understood synergistic solutions and artificial intelligence. He gave me a cold, empty smile that did not reach his eyes. And then he said those exact words that I will never forget. If you are not comfortable with our new direction, well, there is the door. He was the classic tech bro, the kind of guy who had never written a single line of functional code in his life, but believed that leadership meant using buzzwords like paradigm shift and disruptive innovation. Preston was the nephew of our original founder, Edward Harrington, who had retired the previous year. He had written his family name straight to the chief executive suite, and he had about as much understanding of actual cybersecurity as my German Shepherd Major. I sat there in the chair, feeling a strange calmness wash over me. It was the same feeling I used to get when I was a chief petty officer in the Navy, standing in the sonar room when the instruments detected something hidden in the dark water. I looked at the framed photo on my desk, showing the engineering team I had built from scratch. Many of them were kids I had recruited directly from local universities and mentored over the years. I remembered the endless nights we spent running diagnostic tests, fueled by bad coffee and cheap pizza. I remembered missing my own daughter's graduation because our main server farm got hit by a massive security breach during a critical military exercise. I had sacrificed my time, my family, and my health for this place, and now this young MBA graduate was handing me a severance packet and telling me to leave. So I did not argue. I did not make a scene or give a grand speech. I simply stood up, closed my laptop, placed the folder under my arm, and walked out. I walked past the glass walls of the conference rooms where my team members were pretending to be busy, looking down at their keyboards to avoid meeting my eyes. I walked past the receptionist who had known me for 2 decades, and not a single person said a word. The silence in that hallway was heavy, the kind of silence that stays with you. But what these corporate executives fail to realize about men like me is that silence is not submission. Sometimes, silence is a calculation. I did not drive straight home. I needed a place to clear my head, so I drove down to Rosie's Diner on South Lamar. It is an old-school place with red booths and waitresses who have worked there for 30 years, serving coffee strong enough to restart a stopped heart. I ordered a black coffee and sat in a corner booth, just listening to the hum of the diner and letting my mind settle. I was not angry, and I was not planning a dramatic confrontation. I was simply analyzing the situation. Sentinel Shield systems had been my entire life. I joined them back in 1995 when we were operating out of a tiny warehouse, long before the venture capitalists arrived. The company was started by 3 Navy veterans who actually understood the mission. I had watched it grow from a small team of 20 people into a multi-million-dollar defense contractor, and the entire technical foundation, the core encryption algorithms, was mine. I had not documented every detail in the company wiki. I did not need to because the system was in my head. I lived that code. I knew every vulnerability, every bypass, and every security layer because I had written them myself. I paid for my coffee, left a tip, and walked back to my car. It was time to go home. I drove slowly, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple, reflecting on the fact that sometimes you have to let a structure collapse before you can show people who actually built the foundation. The city was changing, replacing the old brick buildings with glass towers, much like what was happening at the office. The older generation who had built the actual technology were being pushed out for younger faces who were better at presenting slides than writing secure code. But slides do not encrypt military communication networks. I knew that the code I had written was the only thing standing between the company and total disaster, and yet they had discarded me without a second thought. I turned onto my street, feeling a deep, solid sense of resolve. They wanted optimization, and I was going to give them a lesson in efficiency that they would never forget. My house in Cedar Park was quiet when I got back. Major, my German shepherd, met me at the door, his tail wagging slowly as if he could sense that my routine had been broken. I patted his head, poured myself 3 fingers of high-quality bourbon, and sat down at the wooden table in the kitchen. I did not open the termination folder immediately. Instead, I walked down the hall to the storage closet and retrieved a box that had been sitting on the top shelf for more than 10 years. It was labeled as personal archives. I carried it to the table, blew off the dust, and began sorting through the old papers. Among the old tax returns and manuals was a thick manila envelope that had been sealed with a notary stamp back in August of 2008. Inside that envelope was a document that represented my insurance policy. It was the original provisional patent application for our core encryption algorithm. My name was written at the top as the sole inventor and owner, not the company's name. Back in 2008, the company was going through a massive financial crisis, and the legal department was so disorganized that they forgot to file the formal assignment documents to transfer the ownership to the corporation. I had been advised by my old friend Felix Salazar, a former Navy Judge Advocate General officer who now practiced intellectual property law in Austin. Felix was a sharp lawyer who knew how to write contracts that could withstand any challenge. He had told me over drinks one night that I should keep the patent under my personal name until the company stabilized and offered me a proper equity stake. They never stabilized their management. They just grew larger and more profitable, and they completely forgot about the paperwork. The legal agreement we had signed back then allowed Sentinel Shield Systems to license my technology under a temporary agreement. But Felix had helped me insert a very specific clause into that agreement, one that acted like a tripwire. The clause stated that in the event of my involuntary termination without cause, the license would terminate, and all rights to the technology would revert to me automatically within 24 hours of my departure. The executives who signed it back then did not think twice about it, because they never imagined a scenario where I would leave. I was the rock of the company, the guy who resolved every crisis, but now the arrogant young nephew of the founder had triggered that tripwire. I opened my laptop and wrote an encrypted email to Felix, attaching a scan of the original patent document and the termination notice I had received that afternoon. I asked him if the reversion clause was still legally binding after 17 years. Then I sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator while Major slept at my feet. The phone rang just before dawn. It was Felix. He did not waste time with small talk. He told me that he had reviewed the filing and the termination letter. He confirmed that since I was terminated without cause, the reversion clause had been triggered. The patent, number 9,847,291, was officially mine again. He explained that as of 4:15 the previous afternoon, Sentinel Shield Systems no longer had the legal right to use my encryption core. Every server they operated, every system they sold, and every demo they scheduled was now using my intellectual property without a license. It was a massive case of patent infringement, and because they had terminated me, they were doing it knowingly. Felix laughed quietly over the phone and told me that I was holding the keys to their entire empire. I thanked him, hung up, and prepared for the next step. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing the technical logs and verifying the timestamps, making sure that every single document was in perfect order before we made our move. I remembered the conversation Felix and I had back when we were serving in the Navy, stationed on the USS Houston. We had talked about how in the military you always have a backup plan, a secondary system, in case the primary one fails. This patent was my secondary system. I had spent 17 years letting them use my work, believing that my loyalty would be returned. I had watched the company grow from a handful of veterans to a massive corporate entity, and I had never complained about the lack of equity or the corporate politics. I had simply done my job, protecting our national security interests and supporting my team. But the moment they decided that my age and my salary were liabilities rather than assets, the deal was off. I looked at the notary stamp on the envelope, the ink slightly faded but still perfectly legible, and realized that my grandfather had been right when he told me to never trust a corporate promise. The law is the only contract that matters, and I had the law on my side. Sitting there in the morning light, I recalled the details of the deployment on the USS Houston. We had been stationed in the Western Pacific, managing communications for the 7th Fleet. The conditions were intense, the space was cramped, and the pressure was constant. We were dealing with real threats, and we had to be absolutely precise. It was during those long shifts in the radio room that I learned the value of legal and technical backup plans. Felix had been the ship legal officer, and he always told me that in the civilian world, people would try to take credit for my creations. He had seen too many brilliant technical minds get pushed out of startups once the money started rolling in. I had taken his advice to heart, and that was why I kept the provisional files under my own name. I stood up from the table, stretched my legs, and went to the window to look out at the backyard. Major followed me, nudging my hand with his nose. I smiled and patted his thick fur, knowing that the foundation was solid and the trap was ready to be sprung. By 6:30 on Tuesday morning, I was sitting at my desk, submitting the formal reversion notification to the United States Patent and Trademark Office. The process was straightforward, using the digital forms we had prepared years ago. I uploaded the notarized contract and the official termination letter. By 7:45, I received a confirmation email from the registry. The ownership of patent number 9,847,291 had officially updated. My name was now listed as the sole proprietor. I did not feel a sense of triumph, just a quiet focus. I opened a spreadsheet and began doing the math. Sentinel Shield Systems was currently generating $850 million annually from their military and government contracts. The industry standard for licensing core cybersecurity patents was between 12 and 15% of gross revenue. 15% of their revenue would equal $127 million a year. But I did not want to destroy the company. I wanted to correct the balance. I drafted my terms, $18 million as an upfront payment for past use, 12% ongoing royalties, a seat on the board of directors with full voting rights, a public statement acknowledging that I was the author of the technology, and the immediate termination of Preston Harrington. Meanwhile, at the company headquarters, Preston was likely preparing for his big day. He was hosting a major demonstration for representatives from the Pentagon on Wednesday morning, showing off the next-generation security system. What he did not know was that the entire system ran on the code he had just lost the legal right to use. My phone rang at 11:30. It was Jeremy Barrett, the lead developer who had worked under me for 5 years. He sounded stressed and exhausted. Jeremy told me that they were trying to compile the final build for the Wednesday demo, but they were running into a major issue with the cryptographic handshake. He asked if I could help him locate a specific configuration file or explain how the key exchange was handled. He said the new team Preston brought in did not understand the architecture and was making a mess of the code. I listened to him, feeling a bit of sympathy for the engineers who were caught in the middle of this disaster. But I also knew I could not help them. I told Jeremy that I no longer worked for the company and was not authorized to access or discuss the proprietary systems. I wished him luck and ended the call. They were heading into a storm, and they did not even have their sails up. I sat back and watched the clock tick, knowing that the gears of justice were turning exactly as planned, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The new engineers Preston had hired from prestigious universities had spent weeks attempting to implement modern buzzword-heavy features like artificial intelligence, predictive defense, but they had completely failed to understand the mathematical core of the encryption. They had treated my code as a black box, a utility they could just import without understanding its inner workings. Now that they had modified the surrounding architecture, the system was rejecting their additions, throwing memory leaks and authentication errors. Without my assistance, they would never be able to stabilize the build in time for the demonstration. I felt a slight twinge of regret for leaving my former team in such a difficult position, but I had to remind myself that they had not stood up for me when I was escorted out of the building. The business world is cold, and sometimes you have to let people experience the consequences of their silence. I poured myself another cup of coffee and began drafting the formal notice that Felix would send to the board of directors, ensuring that every word was legally precise and left no room for interpretation. To understand why they were struggling so much, you have to understand the nature of the encryption itself. The algorithm is a highly customized symmetric key block cipher that uses a dynamic key exchange mechanism based on chaotic neural networks. I had spent 3 years optimizing this algorithm to run efficiently on low-power military hardware, ensuring that field radios could encrypt messages in real time without draining their batteries or causing latency issues. The Stanford graduates Preston hired wanted to replace this elegant structure with a resource-heavy module that relied on external cloud servers, which completely compromised the operational security requirements of the military contracts. They had disabled the internal key validation loops, causing the entire kernel to panic whenever a high-volume transmission was simulated. Jeremy was a good engineer, but he did not have the mathematical background to debug the neural network weights without the original source documentation. I had kept the master configuration keys stored on my personal offline server, and they were about to realize that without those keys, their next-generation system was nothing more than an expensive paperweight. While sitting at my desk, I decided to check the network logs. I had built a diagnostic dashboard years ago that was still linked to my personal workstation. I saw that they had already attempted to run 5 separate test deployments of the new build since that morning. Each deployment had crashed within seconds of the handshake phase. My phone buzzed with a message from Jeremy, asking if I had left some kind of logic bomb or intentional backdoor in the authentication loop because the cryptographic tokens refused to bind to the socket. I called him back immediately. I explained that there was no backdoor. The authentication module was designed to rely on a physical entropy source located on the old server motherboard. The new virtualized cloud servers they were using did not possess that physical hardware, meaning the random number generator defaulted to a fixed state that the receiver rejected as a replay attack. It was basic hardware security. If the new lead engineer had read the documentation instead of firing me, he would have known that. I hung up the phone, taking a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the absolute weight of their impending failure. The discovery happened on Tuesday afternoon. A young legal intern named Wesley was doing a routine audit of the company's intellectual property assets before the big demo. He typed the patent number into the government registry and saw my name listed as the owner. He refreshed the page, thinking it was a database error, but the record remained unchanged. He immediately brought the document to the general counsel, Albert Fletcher. The legal department went into an immediate panic. The senior lawyers retrieved the original contract from 2008 and realized the reversion clause was active. They saw that the company's entire product line was built on a patent that now belonged to a disgruntled former employee. They requested an urgent meeting with Preston Harrington. According to a message I received from a friendly source inside the office, Preston did not take the news seriously. He claimed it was a minor administrative issue that could be resolved with a settlement later. He ordered the legal team to keep the matter quiet and insisted that the demonstration for the Pentagon must proceed as planned. He was convinced that once the contract renewal was signed, he would have the leverage to force me into a cheap settlement, but the lawyers knew better. They understood the concept of willful infringement, which carries severe penalties, including triple damages and a complete shutdown of operations. A junior attorney in the department named Peter drafted a confidential risk assessment memo warning that proceeding with the demonstration would constitute a major legal violation. The memo recommended postponing the demo immediately until the dispute was resolved. The attorney accidentally sent the memo to a distribution list that included Jeremy Barrett, who immediately forwarded it to my personal email. I read the memo on my laptop while Major rested his head on my knee. The document was filled with legal jargon, but the conclusion was clear. Sentinel Shield Systems was in a position of extreme vulnerability. Preston was planning to demo my technology to the highest-ranking military procurement officers in the country, and he was doing it while knowing he did not own the rights to the software. It was a massive gamble, and he was risking the entire company on his own arrogance. I closed my computer and smiled. The trap was set, and Preston was walking right into it. The memo outlined the exact legal arguments that Albert Fletcher had tried to explain to the stubborn chief executive. If Sentinel Shield Systems presented the software to the Defense Department as their own proprietary technology, they would be committing fraud and patent infringement simultaneously. The military procurement rules were extremely strict, and any dispute regarding intellectual property ownership would result in the immediate suspension of all active contracts and a blacklisting from future bidding. Peter had written that the potential financial impact of a lawsuit from me, combined with the loss of government clearance, would force the company into bankruptcy within a matter of months. Yet, Preston believed that his corporate charm and family connections would be enough to sweep the problem under the rug. He had always been protected from the consequences of his mistakes by his uncle, but his uncle was no longer running the company. I realized that the young executive was about to discover that in the real world of federal contracting, a signature on a government document is worth far more than a Stanford degree and a family name. Fletcher was a seasoned attorney, having spent 30 years defending defense contractors in various disputes. He knew that the government did not tolerate legal instability, especially in systems involving tactical communications. He had warned Preston that if the military representatives discovered that the encryption core was subject to a patent reversion claim, they would cancel the current contracts immediately. But Preston had arrogantly told him to handle it and walked out of the meeting to grab lunch. That was when Peter decided to write the risk memo, hoping to protect himself and the legal department from any future fallout. The accidental broadcast of that memo was the final nail in the company casket. When I read it, I knew that my strategy was working. They had no cards left to play, and their entire defense was built on a bluff that I was about to call. To make matters worse for them, Wesley had done a thorough search of the historical files. He did not just check the database once. He searched the physical archives for any record of patent transfer from 2008. He discovered a draft assignment agreement that was created during the financial reorganization, but the signature line for my name was entirely blank. He also found a letter from our external patent counsel at the time, stating that the company had failed to pay the legal filing fee of $50,000, which meant the firm had never submitted the assignment to the federal office. This meant Sentinel Shield Systems had never actually owned the patent. They had been operating on a temporary license that was now terminated. The general counsel, Albert Fletcher, had explained to Preston that the National Security Agency performed security audits every 3 months, and any discrepancy in ownership would lead to an immediate stop work order, freezing all payments from the government within 24 hours. This would leave the company unable to pay its employees, creating a catastrophic collapse. Yet, Preston had ignored the warning, convinced that his personal influence would carry the day. Wednesday morning arrived, and the downtown convention center was filled with high-ranking military officials and defense industry representatives. Preston Harrington stood backstage, wearing a tailored suit, looking confident and ready to secure the contract. The presentation began with a promotional video, followed by Preston taking the stage. He began his speech, talking about the next generation of cybersecurity and how Sentinel Shield Systems had developed a proprietary encryption engine that would protect national security. But before the live demonstration could begin, a senior legal officer named Albert Fletcher walked onto the stage and whispered to Preston. At the same time, printouts of the patent registry showing my ownership of patent number 9,847,291 were being distributed to the Pentagon representatives in the audience. The documents had been leaked to the press and the government officials by an anonymous source who wanted to protect the integrity of the contract. A military colonel named Colonel Collins stood up in the audience and asked Preston to explain why the company was presenting a system built on technology owned by an individual who had been terminated 2 days prior. Preston tried to laugh it off, claiming it was a minor misunderstanding, but Colonel Collins was not interested in excuses. The Pentagon officials stood up and walked out of the room, stating that they would not participate in a demonstration involving contested intellectual property. The room emptied within minutes, leaving Preston alone on the stage under the bright lights, his career in ruins. 30 minutes later, I sent my formal licensing terms to the board of directors. Within 4 hours, I received a call from Colonel Ronald Miller, the retired partner who was now representing the board. He told me that they accepted all of my terms without negotiation. They would pay the $18 million up front, agree to the 12% royalty, grant me a seat on the board, and accept Preston's resignation. I signed the agreement that afternoon. It was not about revenge. It was about protecting the work I had built and reminding the corporation that you cannot discard the people who created your success. I walked out to the yard with Major, feeling the warm Texas breeze, knowing that the foundation was secure once again. The company would survive, but under new leadership that understood the value of hard work, respect, and technical expertise. I stood there, looking at the horizon, ready for the next chapter of my life to begin. The board of directors had acted with surprising speed once they realized the magnitude of the disaster. Colonel Ronald Miller had been furious when he called me, not at me, but at the sheer incompetence of Preston Harrington. He told me that Edward Harrington was deeply embarrassed by his nephew's actions and had personally voted to approve the termination. The corporate board members knew that without my patent license, Sentinel Shield Systems would have to shut down operations immediately, resulting in the loss of hundreds of millions of dollars and their security clearances. My terms were steep, but they were the only way the company could remain solvent. I had secure funding for my future, a direct voice in the strategic decisions of the company I spent my life building, and the satisfaction of knowing that the engineers under my command would be managed by someone who respected their skills. As I walked Major along the quiet streets of Cedar Park that evening, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The corporate games were over, and the veteran had won. During my phone call with Colonel Miller, we had talked about our shared history. He had served in the Navy during the Vietnam War, and he understood the silent code of conduct by which men like us lived. He told me that when he saw the printouts being handed around the convention hall, he knew immediately that I was behind it, and he actually respected the precision of the strike. He said it was a masterpiece of planning, executed without firing a single shot. The board had held an emergency meeting in the hallway of the convention center, and within 10 minutes, they had voted unanimously to strip Preston of his authority. Preston had tried to argue, pointing to his Stanford degree and his family connections, but the board members had ignored him, ordering security to escort him from the building. It was a complete and total victory, and as I watched the stars appear over the Texas landscape, I knew that justice had been served. The board of directors had immediately called the retired founder, Edward Harrington, who was living in Florida. When he heard that his nephew had put the entire government contracting business at risk, he was furious. He personally called the board members and insisted that Preston be dismissed immediately with cause, ensuring that he would receive no severance payout. Colonel Miller told me that they wanted to rebuild the company with the same core values that had defined it in 1995. He asked if I would help guide the transition, not as a programmer but as a board member overseeing the technical architecture and engineering staff. I told him that I would be honored to do so as long as we focused on rewarding the hardworking engineers who did the actual work. As I stood in my yard with Major, I knew that the foundation of the company was finally in safe hands, and the people who built it would never be forgotten.